chapter 11, verse 32, in whom the author had not the time to mention. And tonight we're going to discuss Samson. And we definitely are making some good progress on these judges, and hopefully as we study them it becomes a little bit more familiar, the concept of the times they were living in and the troubles they were facing. But let's pray. Father, thank you for your goodness. Thank you for your word. God, without your Holy Spirit, sometimes your word just bounces on a rock skull. It's just so hard to understand. I thank you, God, that you open our hearts and our minds to comprehend. I thank you through the gift of the Holy Spirit that we can have the mind of Christ, that we can hear a parable and be able to decipher it, and that unto your own, Father, you speak clearly. God, I pray tonight that you would open our minds and our understanding and help us to take from these things that we read in the book of Judges and in the Bible tonight. Help us to take from them and apply them to our lives, that they'd be practical, that they would be weapons for our toolkit in a lost and dying world, that we could be transformed more into the image of Jesus. Father, if it's just for education purposes, it has only a small value. But if it actually helps to empower us to build better relationships with one another and a better relationship with you, then it's worth something. So God, help us to glean the important things for the transition of our lives from the flesh into the Spirit. And God, help me tonight as I teach and as I get the opportunity to speak about your word. And I thank you for the privilege. We love you, God. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, everyone who did come tonight. And also we want to mention that this is a Bible study of the Ecclesia of Christ, and we want to thank the viewers that do watch it from the web. We're talking about Samson tonight, and we're starting in Judges chapter 13. And basically the life of Samson is covered from Judges 13 to Judges 16. And most of us have heard of Samson. Now, last week we talked about Barak, and then the week before that we talked about Gideon. And I think when we introduced Gideon, there might have been a few that knew of Gideon, and then I asked how many of you have heard of Barak, and I think there were maybe 4 hands or so that went up. It wasn't many, but probably tonight most of us have heard of Samson. And if you haven't, that's okay, and this is the kind of lesson in which you get to learn a lot. But just for curiosity's sake, Samson. Anybody heard of Samson before? Anybody? Yeah,
Samson,
looks like. Yeah, it's pretty famous. I mean, there's songs about these guys, you know, and they kind of make their story has kind of made it into the world. Even the world tends to know about Samson and Delilah. Tonight we hope to learn a little bit more than just the story of him with Delilah. But one of the interesting things I want to bring to you just in this study is that in the first study we did about Gideon, does anybody remember who the basic enemy that Gideon was always fighting against? When he was called to be a judge, it was because the people of Israel were oppressed by... Starts with them. Midianites. And then we have Barak. We have the story of Barak. Oh, and one thing, Gideon was of the tribe of Manasseh. And then we have Barak, who's of the tribe of Naphtali. And he was oppressed. The people were oppressed by... Anybody remember? The Canaanites. And tonight, we're going to have Samson, who's of the tribe of Dan, and now they're going to be oppressed by the Philistines. And so there is some pattern. There's some coherency, and there's a thank you, Pete. There's a reason for the way that the book of Judges was lined up, and they're going through these different oppressors one by one, and the different tribes, and what contribution the different tribes yielded in the effort to conquer the oppressors that were in the land of Canaan before they really developed a kingship. When they had the first king, when Saul, they cried out and they said, Lord, give us a king. And Samuel, we'll learn about this in a future study, but Samuel was kind of depressed because they felt like they rejected him as the prophet and the judge of the people. And God says, Samuel, they didn't reject you, they rejected me. If they want a king, we'll give them a king. And they got their first king, King Saul. And then everybody in the faith gets to know who the most famous king of Israel was, and that would be the second king, King David. And so this is kind of all that stuff that went on before the kingship. before they really became a united kingdom. This is the disunited kingdom, if you will. It's the time of the judges, the time of the division with the tribes. They've got one common God, but they're always bickering. They're always fighting. They're always saying, well, you're taking the glory, or you should have helped us in this circumstance, or you didn't help us in that circumstance. And so there's a lot of division. And the Hebrew author is kind of sending this underlying message about the lack of unity in the movement of God through the book of Judges. And so when we get to the story of Samson, it's not just about Samson. It's about the whole nation and the things that they were facing. So we'll start in Judges chapter 13 and verse 1. And it says, "The children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Philistines 40 years." And we talked about this a little bit last week, that the people in that text with Barak, it says that the Lord had sold them out. In the Hebrew text, the Hebrew word literally means God had sold them out to the Canaanites. And in this text, this time it just says He just hands them over to the Philistines to be plundered. And later in the text we'll see that even the people of the tribe of Judah feel that the Philistines rule over them. And so they feel completely controlled by a pagan, outside, lost, non-godly force. And I think that we as Christians can sometimes feel, whether we're in a place of freedom where we're being led and directed by God, or where we're being pushed around by the world. We're God's servant, but we're being controlled and manipulated and steered by the world and the forces outside of God. And there are different points of life for that. The word Philistines is an interesting word worth talking about. First of all, they're considered to be the sea peoples. There's one famous person referred to as a Philistine that we think of when we think of David, that David fights. Who would that be? Anybody think of a famous fight that David had?
Goliath.
There you go, Goliath. Okay, so there's one famous Philistine we often think of. But the Philistines, the word in Hebrew, Philistinim, is spelled exactly the same as Palestine, or Palestinians as we know them today. And a funny story happened to me. I was in Hebrew school in Israel, and I was supposed to write my first kind of short story as they were trying to teach me Hebrew, and I was trying to write and show, kind of give back what they were teaching me. And I had worked on an archaeological dig. So I was in Ekron. I had gotten the opportunity to work on an archaeological dig in Ekron. And they had hundreds of people there, so I was no one special. I was just a digger, And I was assigned to Field 10, and our job was to excavate part of this ancient Philistine wall that was part of what they believed to be the guard tower. And so we're digging around in there, and it's 110 every day. At nighttime, it's 100 degrees. And we slept in these tents. We call them tents, but basically it's just 4 poles with a tarp over the top. So in case you get, a hot rain or something, I can't even imagine they got any rain, but you would have some protection. The thing you were most concerned about is whether you had a net over you at nighttime so that the mosquitoes wouldn't eat you alive. And if you didn't have somebody sleeping next to you, probably the male preference of clothing would have been nothing. It was just hot. It was really hot. And so we'd work all day digging in this dry, hard, crusty dirt with hose and pickaxes and brushes and brooms and then if we find some pottery or find anything, then we get to wash it and clean it in the night. We'd put it into buckets and haul it in the bus back to the camp in the night, in the evening, and you work all day with the dirt and you work all evening cleaning the pottery to see if you find anything special. So here we were, and I can't remember how many thousands of, I think the site was occupied either 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. I can't remember the timing of it, but so here I was 3,000 years ago, a little over 3,000 years, in this guard tower, and I finally hit something, and we began to brush it off, and it was a piece of pottery, and it looked like it was all intact. Most of the time, you're just finding a little piece of shard. And we're brushing it off and kind of cleaning it. You be real careful, and you start getting out your little trowels and your smaller tools so you don't damage whatever you're trying to get out. And as it starts to form, as the dirt kind of gets peeled away, it's a pitcher. And it's not just any pitcher, it's decorated with Philistine paint. And as we began to extract it, it was broken, but it was all there. So it was in pieces, but it had broke over time in place. So the dirt inside and the dirt outside had preserved it in place for 3,000 years. And so we extracted the pitcher, and it had like a spout on it, and it had a strainer spout. And they tested it, and the guys that were the head of the site and the head archaeologists and the people that study, and Sai Giton and Trudy Dotan are the two that were working the site, and they knew, and they looked at it, they said it's a Philistine beer strainer jug. I'm like, a beer strainer jug? I mean, they drank beer 3,000 years ago? Yeah, they sure did. They drank a lot of beer. The Philistines were known for their beer drinking. Matter of fact, they lived in those areas because of the great vineyards they could build, and they could drink a lot of wine. And so apparently these guards were, busting out the beer one day in that guard tower that we were trying to excavate, and where they die and where they lie, and we found the evidence that they may not have even gotten to drink that last pitcher of beer. But it was interesting for me, and it was enlightening. And that will contribute a little bit further on as we go on the study tonight. So there's this couple, and they live, they're part of the tribe of Dan, and they live down there kind of near where the Philistines are, and the Philistines control the area, and Manoah is the man's wife. Manoah is the man, and he has a wife, and his wife is out, and all of a sudden, this man of God, or this glowing individual, comes to her and says, "You're going to have a child." And she's amazed at this news, and she knows that she's been barren and they have no child. And she rushes back to tell her husband, and her husband hears the news, and he's like, "Wow, that's exciting, and I hope he comes again, this man of God, so that we can hear what our instructions are." And she says, "Well, he's given us some instructions that the child has to be a Nazirite." So we're going to talk about in just a minute what a Nazirite is. But sure enough, the angel, or the man of God, as they thought it was at first, appears again, and she calls. She says, "Could you please just wait here while I go get my husband?" So she runs and gets her husband while she's out in the field. She gets Manoah, and they come together, and they hear the instructions. You're going to have a child. He's going to be a Nazirite. God's going to use him to begin to deliver you from the Philistines. It doesn't say he's going to totally deliver you from the Philistines, but to begin to deliver you from the Philistines. And he is to be a Nazirite from birth for life. And so, as a result, I don't want your wife to drink any kind of strong drink. Basically, she almost takes the Nazirite vow too, which we're going to see what that is, to purify herself for the birth of this child. And the guy, Manoah, says, "Well, can we give you some food?" And the angel of the Lord says, "No, you can't. I won't eat your food, but you can offer it up and sacrifice it to Yahweh." And Manoah probably thinks, well, that's a little different. Maybe it's not a man of God. And because they're kind of wondering, is it a man of God or is it an angel? And if you read the text, you see him kind of bouncing back and forth in chapter 13. So they take the kid and the goat and they offer it up in fire. And as the fire goes up, the man of God, in his angelic form, licks up right into the fire and goes up into heaven. Manoah and his wife drop to their knees, and Manoah exclaims, "We've seen God! Surely we're going to die!" And his wife, who is brighter than him, says, "Well, I doubt the angel would have shared all this stuff about a son coming and about the exciting things that are going to happen, about Israel being delivered through a son by us, if he just came to kill us. So we can get up and we can thank God for the promise that he's brought us." And they realized that it was God that was moving. So what is a Nazirite, we need to ask. And I think I'll skip the reading of the text, but I do have it in your notes in Numbers chapter 6, 1 through 26. And I'll sum it up into 3 rules. The first rule of a Nazirite, well, the very first understanding is this is an individual consecrated, separated unto God. The word Nazir is to be separated, to be put apart. And, honestly, spiritually, we as Christians are, in a way, all Nazirites. We're separated. We're called out of this world unto God. We're a holy people, a priesthood, a people of God, to be separated, to be different from the world, to be extracted. We are going to be a peculiar people. People of the world are going to notice that you're different because you're not going to revel with them in the types of things that they do, and you're going to say no in places where they may not even have the self-control to say no. You're going to be empowered in ways that man is usually not empowered to resist temptations of pride and of greed and of lust. And as you submit more and more to the Holy Spirit in you, you will get the victory over those things more and more. And so, in a way, we're spiritual Nazarites, but we're talking about the specific vow of the Nazarite. And when they took this vow, it wasn't always for a lifetime, but in this case, it is for a lifetime for Samson. And the rule number one is no alcohol or fruit of the vine. No beer, no, I don't care what kind of alcohol it is or where you extract it, none whatsoever. A matter of fact, we want you to be so meticulous about it that we don't even want your son Samson to eat a grape. Don't even let him touch a grape. And the boundaries were set wide so that the rules would not be broken. Also, he's not to come into contact with the dead. He's not to be around dead things. In the course of battle, something might die, but he's not to sit here and hang out with something that's dead. If it's been dead, if it's a carcass, he's not to touch it. He's not to mess with it. He's not to be around the dead. And the third thing is, no razor is to come upon his head. He's not to cut his hair. A lot of people think that Jesus was a Nazarite. And actually, it's just a misfortune of history as a result of people who didn't really study their Bibles very well. They thought because Jesus was a Nazarene, he was a Nazarite. Well, a Nazarene is a place, Nazareth. And it's not necessarily saying that everybody born in Nazareth has to be a Nazarite. Jesus was not a Nazarite, and so he was not in that restrictive vow. Matter of fact, he was always hanging out with peculiar people. He was often around the dead, as he would raise them from the dead, and he did lots of things that Nazarites wouldn't have done. And so artists, unfortunately, through time, have depicted Jesus with really long hair. But there's really no evidence or scriptural support for the long-haired Jesus. I'm not saying that he had short hair like Mike here, but he might have more like medium length or whatever was common to his day. But we don't have to have a long-haired Jesus because he wasn't a Nazarite. And there is an evolution to how we got the picture of Jesus we have today. Amos 2, 6 through 16 is an interesting verse worth mentioning simply because God is, it's a later prophecy and it doesn't really have to do with our story, but I like one of the things that he brings out about the Nazarites. And we'll just skip to verse 11. He's angry at Israel because of their disrespect toward him, their disrespect towards his law, their disrespect towards doing the right thing. And in verse 11 of Amos chapter 2, it says, "And I raised up of your sons for prophets, and of your young men for Nazarite. Is it not even thus, O you children of Israel, thus saith the Lord? But you gave the Nazarites wine to drink, and commanded the prophets, saying, Prophesy not." You despised the Nazarites. You despised the vow. You despised the fact that they were separated. And you encouraged them to fall. You encouraged them to break their vows. And that'll mean something in a little while when we get a little further. One of the things we often see in the Old Testament, and I'm still kind of building, all of chapter 13 is building, and then I'm going to get a little bit more preachy, if you will. In chapter 13, we see something that's very common, and that is when an angel of the Lord comes to people, often we see it in a couple different stories of the Bible, they ask, "What's your name? What is your name? I want to know your name. You brought me this special message, and as I go to tell it to our fathers and our families, I want to know what's your name." And in the case of Manoah, when he asked the angel, "What's your name?" the angel says, "Why do you ask my name, seeing it is secret?" And maybe you have other translations out there. It might say, "Seeing it is wonderful." Or the Hebrew word could be translated also, incomprehensible. My name is not something you could even fathom. That gives us a little light into who the angel of the Lord was. And even when God reveals his name to Moses in the wilderness, and Moses says, "Who shall I say sent me? What is your name? What shall I tell them?" And God says, "Tell them, I am that I am." I mean, is that a name? Yahweh is really a verb. It comes from hayah, to be, to exist. I was. It's the translation of the Hebrew verb, to be into being. In other words, God is everything that exists. And without him, nothing exists. And I am. And so when the soldiers came to get Jesus in the garden, "Are you the one?" And he says, "I am." And they all fall back. And there's lots of scriptures in which we see when God exudes the power of his name, everything has to surrender because no life exists apart from the name of God. And here the angel said, "I can't tell you my name. It's a secret. It's incomprehensible. And he went up into the flame. So they had the son. And we see in chapter 13 and verse 24. And the woman bare a son and called his name Samson. And the child grew, and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to move him at times in the camp of Dan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. They named him Samson. We're not too sure why. We don't see in the text that the angel said you got to name him Samson. Samson is very similar to the name in Hebrew, Samson. Okay, so it's like Shemesh. It comes from the same root as the sun. And so maybe some speculate that the Manoah and his wife felt that because the Lord had shined upon them, they would name his name after that shining of the sun. But we're really not sure where Samson got his name. But the interesting part of this verse, in verse 25, it says, the Spirit of the Lord began to move him at times. And that word to move is interesting in Hebrew because what other verse translation? The Spirit of the Lord began to stir. Any others? Move, stir, direct. Okay, and so it's one of those words we can't clearly translate for one word in English. To trouble, to thrust, to impel. It's a vigorous motion. The Spirit of God began to move him, to stir him, to direct him, and it made me think about Jeremiah. In Jeremiah, one time Jeremiah's prophesying, and he says, but if I say, I will not mention God or him, or speak any more in his name, his word is in my heart like fire, a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot. There's something wonderful about God's Spirit, and I hope that everybody in their Christian walk gets to experience it. But sometimes God compels you or moves you in such a way that you just know you've got to say or do or move in the way that He's compelling you to do. Maybe it's something as simple as you're off in the grocery store and you just feel like, oh, it's crazy, but I know I got to go over there and talk to that lady over there. Never seen her, never met her before, but I'm going to go over there and ask her, about something so we can start talking, and maybe I need to share Jesus with her. Or, I just feel like I've got to call sister or brother so-and-so. I don't know why, but I'm going to pick up the phone and call them. And then when you call them, you realize why. And they go, wow, I'm so glad you called. I was just sitting here praying and thinking, God, and then they show you the reason. And God compels us sometimes. And sometimes He compels us to such a degree that we're just like fire shut up in our bones. Like we can't just stop it. We see it a lot with the preaching of the Word, where you'll see a preacher moving and he's preaching along, and then all of a sudden it's just like somebody turned the radio dial. And the preacher goes from kind of being bland to boom, and it's like the Spirit kind of falls on him and he begins to give the word, and it's just like, it's famous for one of those meetings where afterwards you go, it was as if he read my mail. Like, the guy knew too much about me. I've never met him or heard him speak before, but when I walked out of there, I felt like he was talking just to me. And it's God stirring, moving, turning in our hearts, in our minds, in our ways. And the way that the Spirit moves is a wonderful way. And it's so exciting that I want everybody to experience it. But also, after you've tasted it, and you hear the verse in Thessalonians that says, quench not the Spirit. Don't put out the Spirit's fire. Makes you realize, wow, who would want to? Why would you want to put out the Spirit's fire? It's so exciting. It's so revelating, if that's a word. And it's so refreshing. So here's Samson. He's alive. The Spirit of God is beginning to move in his life, and he's grown up as a Nazirite. I'm sure his parents have told him the story of his birth, and he's grown up, and he doesn't really know who he is or what he is, or he didn't see the angel, but he hears the story, and he's been raised up in the Lord and the ways of the Lord. And Samson's just a regular man, like every man. And in verse 14 it says that Samson went down to Timnath and saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. And he came up and told his father and his mother and said, I've seen a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me to wife. Then his father and his mother said unto him, Is there never a woman among the daughters of your brethren, or among all my people, that thou goest to take a wife of the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said unto his father, Get her for me, for she pleases me well. Well, something's gone wrong here. Number one, we know scripturally that God had called the people of Israel to be a separate people. They weren't to mix with the Philistines, okay? But beyond that, Samson goes down and sees this Philistine woman, sees her. He visualizes her. He's walking by his sight, not by his faith, not by his tradition, not by his understanding, not by his training. He just sees this girl, and she looks great. In our language, she's hot, and I want her. And he's still part of the tradition of the time, so he says, Dad, you go get her for me. Because in those days, basically, there was a little bit of a merchandising thing going on when marriage happened. It wasn't the regular a process that we have today of dating and the engagement and finding your own bride. It was more of an arranged thing. And so he's like, Dad, you go down and arrange this for me. And Dad and Mom are like, what? Are you kidding? Why do you got to go to the Philistines to get a bride? I mean, is there no good-looking girl in all of Israel? I mean, is there no one? Really? And I like her. She looks good to me. And he's moving in the flesh, as I would say, completely devoured by the flesh, and he says he wants her. Now, a curious thing about this. Verse 4. But his father and his mother knew not that it was of the Lord, that he sought an occasion against the Philistines. For at that time, the Philistines had dominion over Israel. In other words, God was in this weird thing. Not necessarily in the end result, as we'll see, but God was in the mix. He was going to use this thing. God works all things for the good for those who are called according to His purpose and love Him. He has a way of taking the strangest circumstances in our lives and turning them around for His glory if we surrender our lives to Him, if we're walking in that vow, in that separation unto Him. And something was in the stir here. And to call the end of the story on this one, he's not going to marry this girl. But God's going to be in the mix in order to do something with Samson among the Philistines. And so we go on. And Samson went down, verse 5, and his father and his mother to Timnath, and came to the vineyards of Timnath. Remember what I told you about the Philistines. The Philistines love to drink. They just love to booze it up. And so these are the vineyards where they're growing. And what was Samson doing? Not only did he spy out this girl in Timnath, but he had been crossing the vineyards to do it. What kind of boundaries is that for a Nazirite? You're not even supposed to eat a grape. I mean, had he been eating grapes in the field? I'm not too sure. Samson's convictions weren't in line with what he was called to be, as we're going to continue and see. And behold, a young lion roared against him. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon Samson. He rent him as he would have rent a kid, a young goat. And he had nothing in his hand, but he told his father, he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. And he went down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well. Okay, so this lion jumps out of nowhere, and Samson tears it apart with his hands. Okay, so God is with him. He's anointed him to do things that are spectacular. There are things that are above normal. God is still with him. And he's crossing a vineyard, mind you, as he's doing this. And he finds the woman, and he gets to talk to her for the first time. And it says that she pleased him. In the Hebrew, Tiyasar Be'anai, she was straight in his eyes. That's what it means to please him. She was straight in his eyes. She was right. She was right in his eyes. It's all about his eyes, the pleasing part. And so we'll find in the end of Samson's life, as the Lord said, and even as John, I think, mentioned in his message this morning, it's better to enter heaven without one's eyes than to burn in Gehenna with your full eyesight. Or maybe he mentioned the part about cutting off your right arm. I don't remember. But it's the passage, I believe, in Matthew that is basically encouraging people to recall that the Scriptures did say, do not commit adultery. But Jesus said, I say unto you, if a man looketh at a woman lustfully, he has committed adultery with her in his heart. And it's better for you to go into heaven maimed than to go to hell, to go to Gehenna, go to the place of everlasting fire. So we're going to find that Samson eventually has his eyes poked out. So I'm giving you the endings of the story and building the middle, which is the way you should never read a book. You never pick up the book and read the last chapter. You're spoiled. You won't buy it. Well, maybe you'll save some money. But for today, that's going to be important so that you'll see all the parallels. So he gets down there, and the first thing that they want to do, and when he's heading back out of there, he looks down at the carcass of this lion, and the bees have nested in it. And he scoops down a bunch of honey from the bees and takes and eats some of it and then gives it to his parents as well. But he doesn't tell them where he got the honey. Well, what's wrong with that? Did anybody catch what another thing a Nazarite's not supposed to do besides mingle with grapevines? He's not to mess with the dead body. So he's breaking that one too. And he's constantly going against these separation vows. And so he's not supposed to mess with the carcass. But he doesn't tell his parents. So in verse 10, so his father went down unto the woman, and Samson made there a feast, for so used the men to do. And we're talking about the Philistines. The Philistines would have a feast whenever it came to be the great party for the wedding feast. And you can imagine the type of drinking that they'd want to be doing. And it came to pass when they saw him that they brought 30 companions to be with him. These are supposed to be his wedding party mates. And Samson, and of course, I guess the tradition was you got to give your wedding party mates a bunch of gifts. We kind of see some of this in our practices today about gifts for the groomsmen and the bridesmaids and whatnot. And so Samson said unto them, I will now put forth a riddle unto you. If you can certainly declare it to me within the 7 days of the feast and find it out, then I'll give you 30 sheets and 30 chains of garments. But if you cannot declare it to me, then you shall give me 30 sheets and 30 chains of garments. And they said unto him, put forth your riddle, and we'll hear it. And he said unto them, out of the eater came forth meat, and out of the strong came forth sweetness. Well, we just know what Samson did, so most of us could guess without reading the story too much. He's talking about that little lion experience. Out of the eater came forth meat. He killed that lion, but now he's getting something sweet from it. He says that, and so they're going away trying to figure out this riddle. And they're frustrated because they can't find out the riddle. And they know it's going to cost them 30 garments. And this isn't the days of Walmart where you can just go down to your local garment store and buy clothes. I mean, clothes are hard to come by. And as a matter of fact, most people only have like one garment or two total. I mean, most of us have a closet full. Some of us are so gifted with clothes and things and all our clothing that we have extra closet space, or we have boxes that we put things in for the winter, and then we bring out the summer stuff, and then when we're done with the summer, we box it up and put it up in the attic, and we bring out the winter stuff. I mean, we are just so blessed and in such a different situation than them, but that's not the way it was for them. A set of clothing was quite a gift. And they're having trouble figuring out what this gift is. So they go to the woman, the good-looking woman, who we don't know what her name is, but we know that Samson's got his eyes on her. And they basically tell her, we're going to burn you to death and your family unless you get him to tell the answer of the riddle. And she's like, wow, that's pretty rough. And so when we get ourselves down to 14:15, and it came to pass on the 7th day that they said unto Samson's wife, entice your husband, that he may declare unto us the riddle, lest we burn thee in thy father's house with fire. Have ye called us to take that which we have? In other words, did you bring us together for this feast to rob us? What are you doing, young lady? We need to know the answer to this riddle. And so she begins the process of trying to figure out the riddle. And she says to Samson, tell me, what's the answer to the riddle? Verse 16. And Samson's wife wept before him and said, you hate me. You don't love me. You put forth a riddle unto the children of my people, and you didn't tell it to me. He said, I haven't even told this to my mom and dad. You think I'm going to tell it to you? She wept. 7 days she wept. She cried. Talk about the silent, mean treatment. And the feast lasted, and this is supposed to be a celebration. I mean, we're supposed to be getting married here in 7 days, and she's crying the whole time. And on the 7th day, he told her because she lay sore upon him. And then she turned around and told the riddle to her people. What do we call that? We call that manipulation. It's something we all see. Unfortunately, maybe we participated in. But it's a horrible tool. And in this case, here's this guy who's been separated. He's gifted. He's called. He's set apart. He's got God's attention. He's got the attention of a nation. And yet the manipulation of a woman can snatch him right off a course. Just by a little bit of, you don't love me. And it's a trick. It's a real trick. And I'm not sure Samson did love her. But I don't think that's the real issue. I think she was trying to save her hide and her family's hide. And the men of the city, verse 18, said unto him on the seventh day before the sun went down, what is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion? And he said unto them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, ye had not found out my riddle. He knew instantly that they had done something to get it from her. And the way he riddled it back to them is, if you hadn't plowed with my heifer, you wouldn't have figured out my riddle. In other words, he's calling his wife the heifer, the cow, okay? And it's funny because in Hebrew, this is, I guess, just enjoyment for me, but it has a sweet rhyme to it. He says, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you had not found out my riddle. He says, Luli harashtem be'eglet glati lo matzati haida. So there's kind of a rhyme to it, a music to it, and I just chuckled when I saw it in Hebrew because I was like, wow, yeah, he's waxing eloquently in his wrath because he's really mad. And so what does Samson do? He takes off for a little south down into Philistine territory. He kills himself 30 Ashkelon Philistines. He grabs their clothes. He marches back up with the clothing. He slaps it on the groomsmen. He says, there you go. There's your clothing. Probably still dripping with blood. And this was God. This is how God worked in it. And he was ticked. And it says, and he went home to his dad. He didn't even finish out the party. He didn't go to the seventh day. He just went home to mom and dad. He didn't want to be with her anymore. And the last verse of the chapter said, but Samson's wife was given to his companion that he had used as a friend. So they took the woman and they gave him to his companion. But in 15, we find that Samson, a few days, months, whatever later, I'm not sure, I didn't read it that carefully, after a little time had passed and the wheat harvest had come, Samson decided, I'm going to visit my wife. Now, they've never consummated this marriage. They never finished out the feast. He treks on up there and he finds out, hey, where's my wife? Oh, we thought you absolutely hated her. We gave her to one of your groomsmen. What? You gave her to the groomsmen? Are you kidding? Now I shall be avenged of my wrath. He grabs 300 foxes and he ties their tails onto these firebrands and he sets them into the fields. It's the harvest. He sets them to the fields of the Philistines. And he just burns the Shephelah. It's the lowlands, the area between the high hills of Judea and the lowlands, and as they work into the ocean, that's a great place to grow stuff. And it's just the right time to set them fire-branded fox-burning tails out into the fields and just burn the whole harvest of them. And the Philistines that don't even know Samson, they don't even know the whole story, they don't even know what happened or what took place, are all of a sudden dealing with this huge field fire. I mean, these are not the times when you just dial 911 and say, come get us some water and put out our field. No, you just back off and watch as it burns. And it's gone. And they are troubled. And the Philistines said, who hath done this? Now we're talking about the big group of Philistines, not just some small tribe in Timnath or a little group of Philistines. We're talking about the multitude of them. And verse 6, then the Philistines says, who hath done this? And they answered, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he had taken his wife and given her to his companion. And the Philistines came up and burnt her and her father with fire. You see what the justice is? The very thing that they said that they would do to her companions, her friends, the groomsmen, we'll burn you and your father with fire. We'll burn you and your house with fire if you don't entice Samson. Did you come here to rob us? Now get the answer to the riddle or we're going to burn you guys at the stake, basically. And then in the end, she does what they say to save her own hide and her family's hide. And what is the justice? Her own people come and they burn her and her father in fire. On first grab, we might think that might appease Samson. We might think, well, hey, they took care of her, didn't they? But actually, Samson kind of feels the other way. Verse 7, and Samson said unto them, though you have done this, yet will I be avenged of you, and after that I'll cease. And he smote them hip and thigh with a great slaughter. And he went down and dwelt in the top of the rock Etam. Now, he doesn't. The text doesn't give us the details of what the great slaughter was. But he whips them bad. He basically, in the mind, even in the Hebrew, it kind of hints to, though you've done this, you misdirected my anger. My anger would have been, one, towards the groomsmen who took her. What about him? What about that guy? We don't hear about his family getting burned. He's the one that took his wife. There's no punishment there. So there's kind of this misdirected justice in the mind of Samson, and so he just goes out like a mighty warrior and just starts slaughtering Philistines wherever he can go. And then he goes hides out in this place called Etam, this rock hill. Then the Philistines went up and pitched in Judah and spread themselves in Lehi. And I'm in verse 9. And the men of Judah said, why are you come up against us? And they answered, to bind Samson are we come up to do him as he has done to us. Then 3,000 men of Judah went to the top of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, knowest thou not that the Philistines are rulers over us? So basically this great host of Philistines comes out into the land of Judah. And the Judahites say, hey, what are you guys doing here? And they're saying, hey, we're here to destroy Samson and to do to him what he did to us. We know that it's a pretty big force of Philistines because the Judahites had manifested 3,000 of their own just to deal with the situation. These 3,000 men of Judah, which are part of the tribe of Israel, they're the good guys, okay? They go up to Samson and they say, Samson, don't you know that the Philistines are rulers over us? And Samson says, yeah, I know, but it makes no difference to me. He doesn't say it like that, but I mean, that's the spirit we get from him. And they said, well, we need to hand you over. And Samson says, well, if you promise that you won't kill me, you just tie me up and hand me over, then that's just fine. I'll go peacefully. I won't fight with you guys. See, Samson never had it in his heart. We never read in the text, in the story of Samson, that he ever takes out his anger upon his brothers or the people of God. It's always directed. God had used him, literally used him, in almost the negative sense, used him to be a weapon against the Philistines. And Samson had no problem with faith. Remember, this is one of the guys mentioned in the Hebrews chapter of the great men of faith. Samson never had a problem with faith. We never see Samson wane in his faith. He always believes God's going to do it through him. It's never even a question. Samson never questioned it. Spirit of God comes on him and he just goes and does it. So he's like, oh yeah, you guys bind me up. In his heart he's thinking, yeah, you just bind me up. I know what to do with those strong cords that you just made. And they bind him up and they lead him down the hill to hand him to the Philistines. And the cords just dry up like brittle hair and his boom, he breaks them and he looks around for the first thing he can grab and he sees a donkey's jawbone on the ground. He grabs it and he starts whacking away. And he just starts to kill this whole Philistine army. I'm just whacking them to death. And it's brutal. And he's walking in the Spirit of God to do something. Looking at verse 14. And when he came to Lehi, the Philistines shouted against him, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him. And the cords that were upon his arms became as flax that was burnt with fire, and his bands loosed from off his hands. And he found a new jawbone of an ass, and he put forth his hand, and he took it, and he slew 1,000 men with it. And Samson said, with a jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps, with a jawbone of an ass have I slain 1,000 men. And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking, that he cast away the jawbone with his hand and called that place Ramath Lehi. I got to go to the Hebrew one more time, because there's a Hebrew play here with the word donkey, and what he says, with the jawbone of an ass, heaps upon heaps. Belichai, hachamor, chamor, chamartem. The word for heaps upon heaps is very close to the word for a donkey, an ass, hamor. And so he's mocking them. And in the Hebrew we see that he's gloating over them. And he's saying, with this, I've made heaps and heaps of the Philistines. Well, you got to know that he stinks in the eyes of the Philistines at this point. In verse 18, and after all this, he's really thirsty. And he called on the Lord and he said, thou hast given this great deliverance into the hand of thy servant, and now shall I die for thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised? So the battle is reaped sore, and he's out there and he has no water, and he looks up to God and he says, now after all this, am I going to die of thirst? Is this it? Is it over now, God? I mean, I've had these great exploits. You've given me these great victories. I've seen all these great things. And now the great Samson that you've built up is going to die of thirst. That's it. I'm just going to die out here in the wilderness of thirst. You ever feel that way? You ever look at your life and go, wow, God did this for me. Wow, God opened that door. God provided that for me. Wow. And you got a testimony and you look at the things that God's done in your life and it's so great. But you find yourself in a place in life where you're just parched. You can't seem to even find the Spirit of God. You're just dried up. You're withered. You're like a crackly leaf getting ready to be stepped on and just blown away with the wind. God, I'm thirsty. I want a little more. I'm dry out here. Come on, God. Don't leave me out here like this. Not after all that. You can't leave me out here like this. And that's the estate that Samson's got to. And, you know, we see that with a lot of men of God in the Bible, where they get to that place. David did it when he was in the cave of Adullam. Elijah did it with the ravens that fed him. And Jonah did it with the pursuit to run away from God. And we see that a lot of time when God's stirring in a man's life. And I think it has to do with maybe a little overconfident. Sometimes I think that we get so reliant on God and we get so used to God. God becomes part of our life and we do great exploits. And we might tend to think that we are the ones who actually did them. We might start to think that maybe we accomplished these things in our own strength. We might start to think, well, maybe I could credit myself. Or maybe it's because of my great faith. Or maybe it's because of my great surrender. Or maybe it's because of something to do with my character that these great things have happened in my life. And so God takes the most simple thing, like a drop of water, to remind you that you are nothing without God. Nothing. And we need God for the very breath we breathe. We need Him. And we have to give Him glory and praise for every great thing and every good thing in our life. So Samson was humbled and God provided water. Out of the hollow place, he sprung up some water, and it says that he judged the Philistines for 20 years. I'm going to take about maybe 7 to 10 more minutes, and then we'll finish. I wanted to put a little time into that first segment because that's the segment most of us don't know. Most of us know the story that's coming, the story of Samson and Delilah. But this is what built up to it. So when we enter chapter 16, we enter a little more familiar ground. And the very first paragraph may not be familiar. But Samson, the last paragraph said that he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. And so some time passes again. We're not too sure how much. But Samson went to Gaza and saw there a harlot. And so Samson goes into Gaza into a harlot. This is again, Gaza is a Philistine city. There's 5 major Philistine cities with 5 major Philistine rulers. And this is one of them. And he goes into a harlot. So his second relationship we see with Samson is again, wretched. We see where his weakness is. I mean, this guy, his weakness is in his eyes, obviously, but in his lust and in a drive that's causing him to compromise everything. So he goes to a harlot, and the people in the town realize that he's there. They're not sure where he's at. And there must have been a lot of harlots in that town, okay? But they decide they're going to basically lock down the town and get it ready so they can get him when he goes to leave. And in the morning, it says, when it is day, we shall kill him. And in verse 3, and Samson lay till midnight, and arose at midnight, and took the doors of the gate of the city and the 2 posts, and went away with them, bar and all, and put them upon his shoulders, and carried them up to the top of the hill that is before Hebron. Okay, I don't know how many of you have done any kind of reading or research or gone to some ancient cities or seen anything about gates. But gates for a city are the most heavy and most durable thing that a city has, okay? The walls are there to keep out the enemy, and the gates are usually what are attacked. And so a gate is strong. And this time they were even developing the ideas of how to make metal gates. So we're not even sure. It could have even been a metal type gate of bronze or iron. But the gates have huge posts, and they sit in these hinges, if you will, that are made of stone. And the stone has it carved out like a mortar, pedestal and mortar, and the gate sits in these things. And then it has the big header across the top. And Samson basically goes down, and they're wide enough that they usually open with two, so they can get a cart through them and get some horses through them. And so we're not just talking about grabbing the 36-inch door and carrying it off somewhere and saying, no, I mean, he pulls this thing up, gates and all, and carries it out of town and defies them. He just mocks them again. I mean, we're talking about a guy of faith. I mean, he knew God was going to back his play. He knew it. He knew that these are Philistine rebels. These are abomination to God. These are people that God is opposed to. He knew that God had raised him up for this purpose. And he just grabbed the grades, took off out of the city. There was no man going to kill him at that point. And he did it in the middle of the night, maybe to evade them, I'm not sure. But it was a mockery. And basically, Samson, by this point in his life, we don't know how many years have gone by with this whole tale and all the things that he'd been doing, but he was hated. He was the number one hit list for the Philistine FBI. He was Samson number one. $1 million. No, actually, we'll see later. The reward is 1,100 pieces of silver for the one who can get Samson. So it says, and it came afterward, in verse 4, that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, another valley that's beautiful for wine. A matter of fact, today you can buy the wines of the Sorek Valley in Israel. You can get yourself some great wine there if you want to fall into the sins of Samson. And so he sees this girl down there, and her name was Delilah. And it says, he loved her. It was love at first sight. He just loved her. Those of us that have been married, we know love at first sight is really a misnomer. It's called lust at first sight. Love is something that is nurtured and awakened. Not like that. It's something that has so many other attributes to it. Love is kind. It's pure. It's not boastful. It's not proud. It keeps no record of wrongs. It's not bitter. It's not hateful. It doesn't seek its own good. It seeks the good of the other. Love is willing to lay down its life for the other. This wasn't love. But let's read the story. So he loved her, and what do the Philistines do? Immediately they come to Delilah and they say, entice him! The same exact Hebrew word as they had used, the Philistine that had gone to his first relationship. Entice him. But this time they don't say to Delilah, entice him or we'll burn you and we'll burn your family. They don't even do that. They say, entice him. The rulers of the Philistines, it says, the lords of the Philistines came, verse 5, and said to her, entice him and see where his great strength lies, that by what means we may prevail against him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and we will give every one of us 1,100 pieces of silver. There's 5 lords, 5,500 pieces of silver. Delilah is not stirred from a threat of having her family burned. She's stirred by the material wealth. She's stirred by the greed. I could do a lot with 1,100 times 5 pieces of silver. I could get a lot of things. And so she's interested in the material possessions, the money, the status, the place that'll put her in life, the deception of wealth. The Bible does say that the love of money is the root of all evil. It's so deceiving. Money is weird. It's like we can grab hordes of it, stuff it in our pocket, and it's like we have pockets with holes in them. It just falls right out. It just never achieves what we think it's going to achieve. You save it up and you buy that great dream house you always wanted and you live in it and you realize that the termites come and the cracks come and the rains come and the wind blows the shingles off and the swimming pool cracks and the wiring wasn't just right and you got that car you always wanted. It's fancy, got it all waxed up, and sure enough, the first time you go to Walmart, somebody gives you a nice key mark down the door. Money can't buy what you're looking for. What you're really looking for, the void that we're all looking for, is only filled by the Spirit of God. And the things that we think we can fill with women, the lust, like Samson, it can only be filled with the Spirit of God. Greed, lust, pride, the glory, the respect you're chasing, it can only be filled by having the love of God. That God would look at you and say, my beloved, my dear son, hey, that's the kind of respect you want. Not the respect of all your fellows and your teammates and your brothers and your workmen. The real void in your heart will never be filled with the things of the world, but it can be filled with God. So she goes for it. She takes the offer, and she goes for it. We got 4 segments. First, she says simply, tell me, I pray thee. Please tell me, Samson, where does your strength lie? And he makes up a story, and he says, if you bind me, verse 7, and Samson, if they bind me with 7 green withs that never have dried, then I shall be weak as any other man. And she does it, and then she says, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. When he's sleeping, and she's got him all tied up, and immediately he breaks all these bands. And he jumps up to get him, and she realizes, well, that wasn't real. And in verse 10, and Delilah said unto Samson, behold, you mocked me, and you told me lies. Now tell me, please tell me, where can you be bound? And he said unto her, if they bound me fast with new ropes that never were occupied, then I shall be weak as any other man. So he falls asleep, and she binds him with new ropes, and she gets him when he's good to sleep, and she says, Samson, the Philistines are among you. And he bounces up, and he breaks the new ropes, and he says, where? And she goes, wow, he tricked me again. In verse 13, and Delilah said unto Samson, hitherto thou hast mocked me and told me lies. Now please, wherewith mightest you be bound? It's funny. In the first question she asked, where does your strength lie? Now she's just gotten right to the motive. How can I bind you? How can I tie you up? How can I imprison you? See, they didn't want him dead. They wanted him alive. They wanted to be able to torture him. They wanted to parade him. And he says, if you take my hair, which is pretty long, remember, he doesn't cut it, and if you weave it 7 locks of my head with like a web, and fasten it to a pin, then you shall be able to bind me. So she does it while he's sleeping, and she says, Samson, the Philistines are upon you, and he bounces up, and he pulls the whole bed with him, and breaks the pin, and he's up, and he's at, and he's ready to fight. And verse 15, she said unto him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? Where's your heart, Delilah? I mean, where is your heart? It's just in the material possessions. You mocked me these 3 times, and has not told me wherein your great strength lies. And it came to pass, when she pressed him daily with her words, every day, urging him, so that his soul was vexed unto death. She nagged him and nagged him and nagged him. Oh, you love me. How can you say you love me? Oh, you just don't tell me the truth. You lie to me. You don't treat me with your love. Well, tell me how you can be. She don't care whether he loves her. She just wants something out of him. That's manipulation. It's sick. But it'll take down a man of God. Women, if you want to use that tool, it'll work. It'll work. But you see the end fruit of it. You may get what you want at that moment. But in the end, it may be like the first one that enticed Samson. You and your father's household will burn. There's a consequence for using sin to break the vow of the man of God. So he was vexed unto death. I can't take it anymore. She nags me every day. Oh, I got to tell her. I don't want to tell her. I'm going to tell her. If I don't tell her, she's going to cry and give me that whole sob story again. I can't live another day if she nags me like this. Then he told her all his heart. And he said to her, there hath never come a razor upon mine head, for I have been a Nazarite unto God from my mother's womb. If I be shaven, then my strength will go out from me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. And when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up this once, for he hath showed me all his heart. Then the lords of the Philistines came up unto her and brought money in their hand. Woohoo! Got the money. And she made him sleep upon her knees. And she called for a man. And she caused him to shave off the 7 locks of his head. And she began to afflict him, and his strength went out from him. She began to afflict him. Wow. And she said, the Philistines be upon thee, Samson. And he awoke out of his sleep and said, I will go out as at all other times before and shake myself. And he did not realize that the Lord was departed from him. But the Philistines took him and jagged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with fetters of brass. And he did grind in the prison house. They took him back to where he'd taken that harlot and tore off the doors in the city. He woke up and he thought, I could do it, just as the Lord has always been with me. The Lord will be with me this time. And he did not realize that the Lord had departed from him. What a horrible place to be. To have the confidence and the faith that God can do anything. The realization that nothing can stand against God. That when God is for me, who can stand against me? The confidence that neither angel, nor height, nor depth, nor demon in hell can stand against me when God is for me. And to have that kind of faith that can move mountains and not realize that God has left you. To have that kind of confidence in God and not realize God's left you. You've despised your vow over and over again, Samson. You mingled with dead carcasses. You played in the fields of the vineyards. And you've entertained yourself with the women of the Philistines, even to the point of telling them the secret of your separation. And now your head is shaved, and God is departed. You can only push God's buttons so many times. But God was in this. And God has this incredible mercy. And there's yet one more tale to tell. And so Samson is down there working as a slave, and the Philistines are celebrating their victory, and they even write a song about it. And I know you get tired of my reading my Hebrew, so I won't read it to you this time, but it's in verse 24. In English it says, Our God hath delivered into our hands our enemy, and the destroyer of our country, which slew many of us. And it's a neat song because it always ends in ooh. Every word ends in ooh, ooh, ooh. Hallelujah. Ooh, our God is, ooh, gave us the victory over Samson. Ooh. And who's our God? Our God is Dagon, the fish god. The man fish, the provider of the wheat fields. The provider of the wine. And they throw a big party. Let's get everybody together. Let's have a big party. And they're drinking it up and they're having their feast. And they say, hey, nothing better to make this party than let's bring out old Samson, old blind man himself. Bring him out here so we can mock him and sing the songs to Dagon and sacrifice to our God. And the little servant lad brings out Samson, and Samson says to the little servant lad, he says, Take me over by the pillars of this temple. Put me over by the pillars, please. I need something to lean upon. And he prays to God, and he says, God, just this once more. His hair had been growing back. They'd left him in the stalks. You see, the Nazarite vow was never a vow that had to be for a lifetime. A lot of men took a vow for a year, and that was the Nazarite vow. We see Paul shaving his head in the book of Acts because he had taken a vow. We see hints of different men that had taken the Nazarite vow at different times. And in this case, I'm not saying that his strength was given by his hair, but his strength was given by his separation unto God. And he had separated himself unto God again. He had time to repent in the stocks, in the prison, and the time to meditate about his choices and his moves in life. And he says, God, just this one more time, let me do this one thing, and in my death, let me defeat more Philistines than I did in my life. And he pushes against the pillars of the temple, as you see in my little picture in the notes, and the building comes tumbling down. And there's about 3,000 people gathered there. And it says, in his death, he kills more than he did in his lifetime. He never lacked in faith. He knew that God could do what God had promised to do. Does anyone need communion tonight? One, two, couple. Looks like at least two, maybe three. As we pray, I think some of us can relate to Samson. Little parts of our life, you know. The Philistines in our life aren't people. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but principalities and powers in the evil realm. Sometimes people bring the evil to our lives. They disrupt our life with the evil things they do or say. But really, it's our desire that they all be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. So we don't hate people. We don't go around and kill people like Samson did. But we can relate to his trials, his temptations, the things that pulled him. And we with him can pray, Lord, remember me this last time, only this once. Strengthen me again. We in our greatest weakness can cry out to God in the way that he did. And say, Lord, I've shipwrecked this life you gave me. I've made some choices that make it seem like I can't accomplish, see the dreams that I thought I would see when I was young. My marriage, I've wrecked it. It's beyond repair, Lord. My relationship with my children, my relationship with my parents, my relationships with someone, they're just destroyed, God. I've made choices, I've done things that just, I don't know how to fix them. Have the faith of Samson tonight. God can fix these things. God can work a miracle in your marriage, your relationship, your life, and your job, and your dreams. God doesn't really want you to cast off dreams that are given by him. Now, if it was a dream that came strictly from the flesh and a desire of the flesh, then it's time to get on board with God's dream for you. God had a dream for Samson, and God realized it. And God's got a dream for you. You're his beloved. Don't feel like you've reached a point where you can't attain it. Have the faith that Samson had. Father, thank you for your goodness. Thank you for these Old Testament men, these judges. They sweat blood and tears to learn many lessons that we learn today. Father, I'm glad that we don't have to live the lifestyle they lived, the danger, the reality of war and fighting and all the stuff they did. You've given us a time that is so much different and a message that is so much more powerful, the gospel message, to love our enemies, to show them a love that passes all understanding, a love that can save a soul from hell. God, I pray that you would help us to recapture our dreams. Some of us have lost dreams. We've just been pounded by the world. We've been pounded by the Philistines in our life so much, God, that we don't even believe it's possible anymore. We feel like our eyes have been gouged out. Our arms have been cut off. And yet, God, this one last time, you can do it. We know that all things are possible through you, Father. And we want to be the best sons and daughters we can be for you, God, giving you glory and praise. And though we offer you just filthy rags, through the cleansing blood of Jesus, you've given us righteousness and life. Thank you for your Spirit. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.